This offseason will be full of important days for the New York Jets franchise. Today, I'm going to give you 3 critical offseason dates to watch on the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, February 2nd, Groundhog's Day 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. This podcast is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. If you like what you see or hear, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out and help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is presented by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. Pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's PrizePicks.com, promo code LOCKEDON. Well, the Jets are approaching the offseason. I guess, well, we've been in the offseason, but we haven't seen any player movement yet, and that's the important part of the offseason. Free agency is over a month away. The draft is still far off in the distance. We'll have plenty of time to get ready for Jets offseason moves, but not every day in the offseason is created equal. And today I'm going to give you 3 dates to keep your eye on, because these are 3 days that have significance in one way or another for the New York Jets as they approach every offseason. I'm not going to say a critical offseason because every offseason is critical, but an offseason where the Jets are going to try and get their team from 7 wins to the playoffs. The team made some strides this season. It ultimately was not enough to break the long playoff drought as the team ended the year on a 6-game losing streak. Now can they straighten things out? Now, as we all know, the Jets have a need at the quarterback position, and they've actually confirmed. It's somewhat surprising a team is this open with its ambitions at the quarterback position, but Robert Saleh has confirmed that the Jets are looking for a veteran quarterback to take over the starting role. We all know what happened with Zach Wilson, so now all eyes are on veteran quarterbacks who could be on the move, the biggest name of which is obviously Aaron Rodgers, and that situation will play itself out. Rodgers said this week that he's not sure what he's going to do yet, so we don't even know whether he's going to return for this season. We don't know whether he's going to stick with Green Bay, whether he's going to look for a new team. The Jets will probably be rumored as a potential suitor for Rodgers as long as the situation's up in the air, though. However, the number 2 option out there, as far as talent goes, is probably Derek Carr. And he is the source of our first date to watch this offseason. And that's coming up in less than 2 weeks. It's February 15th. And the reason this date is so important is because of Carr's contract. At that point, around $40 million becomes guaranteed for Derek Carr. And it seems logically, now, it's a little bit dangerous to ascribe logic to the Raiders because they have not handled this Carr situation all that logically. And we can begin with the fact they benched him for the last 2 games of the season. And the reason they did that is they were worried he got injured, because if he gets injured, money becomes guaranteed. But the odds of Derek Carr suffering a career-altering injury in those games was kind of small. And in benching him for those games, they essentially gave away that they're not keeping him. And I think that to keep leverage in these trade situations, you got to make other teams believe that there's a reasonable chance that you're willing to keep the player. And the Raiders have already thrown that out. And they apparently have not let Carr seek a trade out yet. So we're making a leap of faith here saying the Raiders are going to handle this thing logically. With that said, if the Raiders were to handle this thing logically, February 15th would be something of a deadline. And that's because, again, around $40 million, a little bit more than $40 million becomes guaranteed for Carr at that point. So why is that significant? Well, if you're the Raiders, you want to trade in place by then. And essentially, you need to find out whether you could trade this guy by February 15th. Because if you can't trade him and that money becomes guaranteed, then you're on the hook for it. And we know you don't want to keep him. Everything you've done says you don't want to keep him. So you can find out. Now, the trade cannot become official until March 15th, the new league year begins officially. The 2023 league year officially begins. But you can work out the trade compensation in advance. It's what happened a couple of years ago when the Lions and Rams worked out a trade for Matthew Stafford. So there's nothing to stop the Raiders from negotiating with other teams, even though apparently they haven't really let Carr do that yet. So essentially the Raiders are either going to have a trade in place by February 15th, or they'll probably have to cut him. Again, leap of faith, Raiders are going to use logic here, but if no team's interested in making a trade for Carr, that means you're going to be stuck with him if you don't cut him. And you have to cut him by February 15th. And this is why Carr could be the first domino to fall, so to speak, in the quarterback carousel of the offseason of 2023. Because they have that deadline. And if the Raiders do cut Carr, he becomes a free agent immediately. And there's a distinction between Derek Carr and other free agents. So let's take somebody who's going to be a free agent once in March, once the league year begins, like Lamar Jackson. Now, in reality, we know the Ravens are likely to franchise Lamar Jackson. But at this point, there's a real chance. At this point, Jackson's set to become a free agent. Lamar Jackson cannot start talking with another team until March because his contract technically runs through the end of the league year. So even though, he's a free agent to be, he's still technically a member of the Ravens until March, until the new league year. And, the NFL has all these rules about the legal tampering period where you can legally talk to players maybe a day or two early, but the players are still technically a member of their team through March. If Derek Carr is cut, he's a free agent immediately. So that means in February, teams can go out and try to sign him to a contract. So one way or another, there's a very good chance that by February 15th, or if he's cut maybe a few days later, Derek Carr already has a new team. And this complicates things a little bit for teams like the Jets who are looking for a new quarterback but could be interested in Aaron Rodgers, because there's a good chance, and listen, Rodgers is a whole nother story. I've given up trying to predict what Aaron Rodgers is going to do, but based on what we know right now, it doesn't seem like the Aaron Rodgers situation is likely to be resolved by February 15th. Now, again, Aaron Rodgers has been so up in the air the last couple of years that anything could happen. But let me take you through a hypothetical scenario. We don't know what's happening with Aaron Rodgers yet. Derek Carr becomes available in the middle of February. If you're the Jets, that presents you with kind of an interesting dilemma, because Rodgers is probably the better quarterback right now, but Carr's available, and he's available. And not only that, if you don't act early, he's not going to be there in the future. And then you're really putting a lot of your eggs into the Aaron Rodgers basket, which, if you listened to my show last Friday, I've got some issues with the Jets potentially trying to get Aaron Rodgers, and I kind of doubt it's going to happen. But let's say Jets are interested in Rodgers. Do you go for the sure thing? Because if you get Carr, you've at least stabilized the quarterback position. Maybe you don't have the highest ceiling in the world at the quarterback position, but you've at least stabilized it. And if you let him go, then you risk losing out on any potential answer or any viable answer, because you're going to be stuck with the Jacoby Brissetts of the world. And I'm not high on Garoppolo. The more I research this whole Garoppolo thing, I think he's a bad idea, because I don't think he's that much better than some of these other options. I think he's been essentially lifted up by the San Francisco infrastructure. I think he's going to make way too much money. So really the top options are Carr and Rodgers. And if you pass on Carr under the idea you're going to get Rodgers, that's an enormous risk, because you could very well end up empty-handed. Carr is not the best option out there. I think if we're just talking purely in terms of talent. Now, price-wise, that's a different story. Price-wise, I do think Carr might be the best value for the Jets. But even though he's not the best option, you don't want to be caught empty-handed at the end of quarterback season. So that date, February 15th, becomes very important, because that's the date where the Jets are really going to have to decide whether they want to make a move or not, or whether they're going to roll the dice on the big swing at Aaron Rodgers. It'll be fascinating to see what the Jets do. I'd go for Carr. I think Carr, in my view, is that he's the least bad of the options. I don't think there are any great options for the Jets. I think Carr is the least bad option. So February 15th is an important date. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to fast forward a couple of months, because after February 15th, we'll hit free agency. The draft will be coming into sight, but there's an important date in the middle of April that I think could have some pretty big significance for the Jets this year, and I'll tell you what it is as we continue this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. It's the only app you'll need for your Super Bowl party. It's America's #1 sportsbook, and we're very excited to have FanDuel as a new sports betting partner at Locked On, as they are the #1 sportsbook in America. And if you're new to FanDuel, that's even better, because they have so many great features that make betting on sports fun and easy. Download the FanDuel app now so you can bet Super Bowl 57 with a no-sweat first bet. You'll get up to $3,000 in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. And FanDuel will let you bet on everything from the money line to point spreads to who will score a touchdown. The FanDuel Sportsbook app is safe, secure, and super easy to use. And best of all, you can get paid your winnings instantly. It seems like it's a toss-up in Super Bowl 57. Will it be the Eagles? Will it be the Chiefs? Well, join FanDuel today at FanDuel.com/lockedon, and you'll claim your no-sweat first bet on Super Bowl 57. Again, that's FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen every day. Here at Locked On, we have lots of great shows, and you should know that Locked On is heading to the Senior Bowl. Get analysis from the hosts that cover the NFL's next generation in college, and find out which NFL draft boards these players will be climbing, all in one location. Subscribe to Locked On NFL Draft for nightly live shows from the Senior Bowl tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern. And today on Locked On Jets, we're talking about the offseason, talking about critical dates. We all know the NFL draft's a critical date, so I don't need to tell you that. But I have another date in mind in April that really could impact the Jets going forward, and that's April 17th. And I'm prognosticating a little bit here. The Jets have not given us their official schedule for the offseason program, but NFL teams are allowed to begin the offseason program April 17th. The Jets will begin theirs somewhere in that neighborhood. We don't know exactly when. If we're judging by last year's schedule, it probably will be April 17th, because the Jets began it the first day they were eligible to begin it last year. Why is that significant? Well, of course, players begin training during the offseason during that date. But it's also a date that Quinnen Williams has set as a deadline that he wants a new deal done by. Now, we don't know what that means. We don't know how serious this is. We don't know whether that's actually a firm deadline for Quinnen Williams to get a new contract. The Jets have some options at their disposal, as he enters a season where he's still under contract. It's not like he's going to be on another team. Sometimes what happens is a player is upset because he doesn't have a new contract, just skips the offseason program. And the reason they do that is there really are not many options at the player's disposal to display his displeasure with the team. Because if you hold out during the season, you get fined, and you don't get your game check. You don't get paid for the games you miss. If you hold out from training camp, you get fined. But the offseason program is voluntary, so a player can do that to display his displeasure. And, of course, it creates a distraction. It creates a storyline because there's not a lot going on at the offseason program, if we're going to be honest. The writers who are there, the media members who are there, are just looking for any sort of story because, quite frankly, the offseason program is not very interesting. So it generates a lot of buzz. And typically these contract standoffs, they can be a distraction. Now, a distraction in April and May doesn't really impact the team that much. But it's the type of thing that could linger. And the question is Quinnen Williams setting this as a hard deadline? My guess is probably not, because the Jets still have the franchise tag at their disposal if they can't come up with a long-term deal. But I personally, and I think a lot of you probably feel this way, I do not want to see an acrimonious contract negotiation. One of the most frustrating things with the Jets in the Woody Johnson ownership is it feels like the first frustrating thing is that they seldom seem to have star players. But the second frustrating thing is, in the rare occasions where they do have star players, the contract negotiations are always so painful. There's always such bad blood that develops between the two sides. Even when they get a deal done, it's never easy. It feels like it's hard. Things are made harder than they need to be. I just want to see this get done. You went in the NFL with great players. And last year, Quinnen Williams made the leap. He became a great player. He became the type of guy who was maybe the biggest driving force. Now, in football, it's never as simple as one player, but if you look at last year's Jets team, talking about the biggest reasons they jumped out to that hot start, Quinnen Williams is right there. He became everything we wanted him to be. I mean, for the first 3 years of his career, he was good. He wasn't great, though, and a lot of people were very disappointed in him for that. And to be honest with you, I was actually a big defender of Quinnen because I felt like it's never fair to ask a player to be great. Well, Quinnen was great last year. He was everything you asked him to be. And I think it's time for the Jets to pay him. I would have paid him last year. I thought he was good enough. I think at some point you need to say, you know what, we're going to keep good players here. The Jets are trying to build this thing up, and finally it feels like we've at least cleared the first step. The Jets have had like 4 or 5 rebuilds in the last decade or so where they could not even clear the first step, which was, improving the team, getting a base of talent in here that can move the needle. They finally have that, and Quinnen Williams is the driving force. Now you have some other younger guys who are not up for contracts for a few years, so this is really the one opportunity you have to say, we're going to keep talent around here. For once, we're not going to let a great player get away. We're not going to trade him away for draft. Listen, I love draft picks, but I don't want to trade Quinnen Williams for draft picks. This is an opportunity to send a message to your fan base. You always hear about a team when they sign a player to a long-term deal, send a message to the locker room, and the idea is that players see that good work gets rewarded by the team. I think the Jets could also send a message. I know you don't do things for the fans, but the Jets could also send a message to the fan base that we're going to actually try and build this thing up. We're not going to just hit the reset button and trade Quinnen Williams off for picks. And we're not going to create animosity with our star player by dragging out these contract negotiations. It would be nice to just see the Jets get something done. This is a guy who's earned it. A guy who's a great player. A guy who's one of the best defensive tackles in the NFL. To me, there should be no debate here. Just get the deal done. He's earned a premium contract. You know what? If you did not want to give him a premium contract, you should have worked out a deal a year ago. It's time to pay Quinnen Williams. And the start of the offseason program, estimated date is April 17th. That's the point where Quinnen Williams said he wants the deal done by. And if he doesn't get it, it just feels like this is going to turn into another classic Jets situation where there's acrimony with the star player, needless frustration. There really should be no debate. Quinnen Williams should be, I'm not going to use the term Jet for life, because I don't know if he's going to be a Jet for life. He should be a Jet for the next couple of years, though, and he should be a high-paid Jet because he's earned that level of compensation. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close out our show, and I'll give you one more date. We're going to move forward into a few weeks before the summer because there's a critical date at the beginning of June that NFL teams always keep their eye on when they manage their salary cap. And we'll discuss it in more detail as we continue this Thursday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. We have the Super Bowl coming up, and to play PrizePicks, you pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 25 times your money on any entry. There's no competing against other people, it's just you versus the projections available. And PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you want to watch. So we know NFL season's ending, but you can play NBA, you can play NHL, you can play the PGA, men's and women's college basketball. When baseball starts up, you can play Major League Baseball, and you can even play disc golf. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's just that easy. They have safe and fast withdrawals, and they are currently operational in over 30 states and in Canada. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. So if you deposit $100, PrizePicks gives you another $100. Or if you deposit just $50, PrizePicks gives you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for an instant deposit match of up to $100 using PrizePicks. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday. We're talking about important off-season dates to remember. We've talked about a date in February. We've talked about a date in April. Now let's imagine the weather's a little bit warmer, and we're going to go to June 1st, which is an important day for teams across the NFL because there's something that happens with the salary cap on June 1st. And first I have to take you through the concept of dead money. What's dead money? Well, I think here's the best way to think about it. Over the lifetime of a player's contract, every single dollar you pay a player eventually ends up on your team's salary cap number. But the salary cap has ways of allowing you to push dollars to the future. So you could pay a player conceivably $5 million this year, and the player could count against your cap $1 million this year. The other $4 million will eventually be counted against your cap, but you can push that off to the future. It could be so you pay a player $5 million this year, he may only count $1 million against the cap this year, but in future years, that extra $4 million will also count against the cap. When you cut a player, every dollar that you've paid him in the past that has yet to be accounted against the cap is charged to you upfront immediately. So let's say the player gets cut the beginning of next year, that extra $4 million goes on your cap immediately. There's an exception though. If you cut a player after June 1st, you can still spread that hit out a little bit longer. So again, our example is $5 million first year. Player gets $5 million from the team. Cap hit only counts $1 million the first year. Year 2 comes. You cut the player. Now, you cut the player before June 1st. The extra $4 million all goes against your cap that year. You cut the player after June 1st. You can spread out that $4 million over multiple seasons. And it's a tool teams can use to help navigate the salary cap, especially if they're tight against the cap. And the Jets are tight against the cap. Now, there's another caveat here. You actually don't need to wait till June 1st to cut a player this way. You could actually designate a player a post-June 1st cut and essentially cut him earlier and just say, we're essentially cutting this player as though he's cut on June 1st. So that's, that it's a little bit deceiving to say it's June 1st. I mean, it's kind of a relic of rules in the past in the NFL. But the Jets do figure that they're going to be tight up against the cap this year. And there are some players who could save them quite a bit of money if they're cut after June 1st. One of them is C.J. Mosley. Now, if the Jets cut C.J. Mosley before June 1st, they only save $6.5 million against the cap. They cut him after June 1st, they save $17 million against the cap for this year. Now, the rest of that money will have to be paid in the future, but you're talking about $10.5 million worth of savings by waiting till after June 1st to cut him. I don't know if the Jets are going to cut C.J. Mosley, but it's an example. Dwayne Brown is another example. So Dwayne Brown, if the Jets cut him before June 1st, they save about $5 million in cap space. They cut him after June 1st, $9.7 million, so almost $10 million. So $4.5 million more cutting Dwayne Brown after June 1st. So those are the two big players that I'd say could come into play as potential post-June 1st cuts. I'd be surprised if Dwayne Brown is back next year. I think it would be tough to bring him back. I think the Jets got probably the last decent football Dwayne Brown had in him, and you could tell, especially near the end of the year, he wasn't playing that well. Mosley's another story. I don't love the idea of the Jets keeping Mosley. I think this contract has been a disaster for the team. I don't care that he was all pro this year. I think that was based on reputation. I think him making the Pro Bowl was based on reputation. I don't think he's a terrible player, but this contract has not worked out whatsoever for the Jets. He's gotten way too much money during his time with the team. He really has not been anywhere close to the level of player he was in Baltimore. That said, I think the coaching staff really likes him. I think he's a leader in the locker room. I think the coaching staff appreciates that. I do think there's a good chance Mosley's back, but if the Jets were to cut him, the post-June 1st designation would probably come into play because you'd save so much more money. And again, the Jets are not a team with a lot of cap space this offseason. The Jets are going to have to do some maneuvering to, first of all, get under the cap, but second of all, to make moves that they need to make to improve the roster, especially at the quarterback position. They have to figure out ways to create cap space. And the post-June 1st designation might be a way for them to do it, even though, technically it's not June 1st. But essentially what the post-June 1st designation allows you to do is it allows you to spread the dead money out for a player you cut over multiple seasons, thus creating short-term cap space. It's really the only time it really comes into play is when you're really tight up against the cap, because otherwise you just wouldn't do it. Otherwise you just take the cap hit now. But for a team like the Jets, it's the type of thing that can be beneficial. Although you do have to deal with future dead money hits. You're pushing dead money that you could just get out of the way now into 2025. So that's the drawback to the post-June 1st cap hit. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps the channel out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.